Welcome to Bible Study, Parody, and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel. I've come to the conclusion that there are no true parallels to the passion narrative of the Gospels in ancient literature, at least not that I've been able to find. Really, there are no true parallels to the Gospel story at all. That's not to say that there aren't parallels, they just aren't complete. They're partial parallels. Now, some people, usually not scholars, unless they are particularly bad scholars, will point to the dying and rising gods myths, especially those coming out of ancient Egypt, as parallel to the death and resurrection of Jesus in the Gospels. But scholarship abandoned that idea a long time ago. Even the whole category of dying and rising gods as a pattern has been called into question. Better parallels are found in the martyrdoms of the Hebrew prophets and ancient Greco-Roman philosophers, of course without resurrection. The parallel with the prophets is very general. Various texts speak of Israel's prophets being killed by kings, but none of these events are actually described, nor are any of the prophets named, except possibly Isaiah, who in the much later Talmud is said to have been sawn in half by King Manasseh. So the parallel with the prophets is a general one. But Jesus is portrayed as a prophet in Matthew, and the Gospel of Luke says that he has to go to Jerusalem to meet a prophet's fate. So there is a substantial partial parallel there. Probably the best parallel is that of the ancient Greco-Roman philosophers, some of whom were tortured and killed for opposing tyranny. The philosopher Zeno, according to at least one source, was even crucified. These philosophers, who were teachers with disciples and advocated for justice in society, albeit their own particular versions of justice, were publicly humiliated in death, but remembered as heroes dying a noble death. So their horrible deaths were at some level transformed from shameful deaths into honorable ones by their much later followers. And by the way, I'm not including Socrates in this list because he was not tortured, and his death was by suicide and thought to be noble even by his contemporaries. The written memories of these martyr philosophers are sketchy, and none are described in quite the same sort of lengthy detail as is the torture and death of Jesus in the New Testament Gospels. Not to mention that the only descriptions that we have of their martyrdoms come from texts centuries later, and are often compiled in lists of other philosophers, not in works devoted to them alone. And of course, none are said to have risen from the dead with all the victory that rising from the dead signifies. None of them were peasants either. In contrast, Matthew was written in the same century as its protagonist and gives us a much more detailed description of what happens to Jesus. And the story and build-up with all the textual allusions, the sense that prophecies of liberation are being fulfilled, all the apocalyptic imagery is simply unparalleled. Matthew and the other gospel writers in the New Testament present a martyrdom like no other, one that ushers in the dawning of a new generation, a new society, the coming of the human one. My name is Bert Newton, and this is episode 66 of Bible Study, Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel. This part of the Passion narrative is so intense that I feel we need to examine it in small pieces. But I don't just want to break it up like that. The whole is so powerful that it deserves to be read as a whole. So I'm going to read it all at once and then break it up into smaller bits. So this is Matthew 27, verses 27 to 54. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, And after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. As they went out, they came upon a man from Cyrene named Simon. They compelled this man to carry his cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among them by casting lots. Then they sat down there and kept watch over him. Over his head they put a charge against him which read, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." Then 2 bandits were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him, saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he wants to. For he said, 'I am God's son.'" The bandits who were crucified with him also taunted him in the same way. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "This man is calling for Elijah." At once one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. But the other said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." Then Jesus cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last. At that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom, the earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now when the centurion and those with him, who were keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, "Truly this man was God's Son." Now let's go back and take the first 5 verses 27 to 31. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. Then they put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. The parousia is well underway now, the coming of the Son of Man, the coming of the human one. This is Jesus' coronation ceremony, where he is finally crowned Messiah, King of the Jews, with a crown made of thorns. The scarlet robe is likely the cape of a Roman soldier being used as a substitute for a royal robe, which would be purple. This robe also seems to be part of a series of literary signals evoking the memory of the rebel leader Simon Bar Giora, which the next verse continues. Let's read that next verse, verse 32. As they went out, they came upon a man from Cyrene named Simon. They compelled this man to carry his cross. The soldiers compel a man named Simon to carry Jesus' cross. We are not told why, presumably because the flogging earlier has left Jesus too weak to carry it himself. The Gospel of Mark tells us that Simon was the father of 2 guys named Alexander and Rufus, indicating that Simon and his family subsequently became part of the movement. The name Simon recalls for the audience that Simon Peter, the story's most prominent disciple, tried to dissuade Jesus from going to the cross, then said that he would never desert Jesus, even if the others did, and would follow Jesus to the cross. And then Simon Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times and deserted him with the rest of the disciples. Here, another Simon carries the cross with Jesus, and his family ends up joining the movement. This is also, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, another part of the imagery that likely recalls for Matthew's original audience in the late 1st century the memory of one of the rebel leaders of the uprising of 66, Simon Bar Giora. Simon Bar Giora took the title King of the Jews. He was captured in Jerusalem wearing a purple cape, much like the scarlet cape the soldiers put on Jesus. Simon Bar Giora initially would not speak, or at least would not answer questions about his identity directly. Richard Horsley suggests that he may have been offering himself as a sacrifice for the nation in the same way that Jesus uses the sacrificial metaphor for himself in Matthew. Simon's rise to power in the rebel movement had Davidic themes, like Jesus in Matthew. Simon was paraded through the streets of Rome and then executed, much like Jesus is about to be paraded through the streets of Jerusalem and executed. Josephus says that he was executed at the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, indicating the Tarpeian Rock, where prisoners were executed by being thrown from that 80-foot-high cliff. As you may recall, if you've been following along in this podcast series, the temptation in chapter 4 by the devil for Jesus to throw himself from the temple, only to be saved by angels, is a temptation not to go through with martyrdom and rather be saved by angels. It may be that the execution of Simon Bar Giora is part of the backdrop for that temptation. Jesus is tempted to escape martyrdom by throwing himself from a temple only to be saved by angels, and Simon Bar Giora seems to have been martyred by having been thrown from a temple. Again, the memory of Israel's rebel or military leaders constitutes much of the backdrop for Jesus and contrasts with his nonviolent revolutionary life and death. Let's continue with the next two verses 33 to 35. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. There are several texts in the Hebrew Scriptures, mostly from the Psalms, that lie behind these verses, that these verses allude to, and those familiar with them would hear them almost like sad, somber music playing in the background. Psalm 69 is a lament from a persecuted righteous person, and verse 21 reads, "They gave me vinegar to drink for my thirst and gall for my food." While the NRSV reads, "They offered Jesus wine mixed with gall," some of the ancient manuscripts of Matthew read vinegar instead of wine. Psalm 22 is a cry from David describing severe torment at the hands of his enemies. Verse 18 reads, "They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." The original audience, steeped in the texts of the Psalms, which are intended as music, would be reminded of these psalms, perhaps almost hearing them as the background music, much the way in which, in movies today, there is sometimes familiar music playing in the background to help the audience feel the gravitas of the moment. Let's continue with the next verse, a very short one, verse 36. "And they sat down there and kept watch over him." They is the soldiers. Ironically, the soldiers keep watch, something that Jesus challenged his followers to do in the discourse of the little apocalypse in chapters 24 and 25, and something the disciples were unable to do in the Garden of Gethsemane. Just as his coronation ceremony happens with a crown of thorns while being mocked by Roman soldiers, so also it is the Roman soldiers who keep watch. They believe that they are keeping watch as they normally would, perhaps to make sure that his followers don't come to save him. But really, they keep watch for the coming of the human one. Let's continue with verses 37 to 44. "Over his head they put a charge against him which read, 'This is Jesus, the King of the Jews.' Then 2 bandits were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, 'You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross.' In the same way, the chief priests, also along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he wants to. For he said, 'I am God's son.'" The bandits who were crucified with him also taunted him in the same way. Jesus is mocked by passers-by, by the chief priests along with the scribes and the elders. Even the so-called bandits on his right and his left mock him. The term translated by the NRSV as bandits is one that Josephus uses to refer to the revolutionary rebels of the uprising of 66. The audience recalls that the mother of two of the disciples asked Jesus to have her sons seated on his right and his left, with the exact same language as is used here, once he has come into his kingdom. This picture of Jesus on the cross is Jesus entering his kingdom. It continues Jesus' royal coronation ceremony, with co-revolutionaries on his right and his left. But instead of praising him, everyone mocks him, even the other revolutionaries. Psalm 22, in which David speaks of being taunted and mocked by his enemies, continues to be in the background, with some of the verbiage in this passage taken from that psalm. Warren Carter suggests that chapter 2, verses 10 to 20 from the Book of Wisdom are also part of the backdrop here. This is how that text reads. "Let us oppress the righteous poor man. Let us not spare the widow, or regard the gray hairs of the aged. But let our might be our law of right. For what is weak proves itself to be useless. Let us lie in wait for the righteous man, because he is inconvenient to us and opposes our actions. He reproaches us for sins against the law and accuses us of sins against our training. He professes to have knowledge of God and calls himself a child of the Lord. He became to us a reproof of our thoughts. The very sight of him is a burden to us, because his manner of life is unlike that of others, and his ways are strange. We are considered by him as something base, and he avoids our ways as unclean. He calls the last end of the righteous happy, and boasts that God is his Father. Let us see if his words are true, and let us test what will happen at the end of his life. For if the righteous man is God's child, he will help him, and will deliver him from the hand of his adversaries. Let us test him with insults and torture, so that we may find out how gentle he is, and make trial of his forbearance. Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for according to what he says, he will be protected." The audience of Matthew perhaps hears this passage from the Book of Wisdom as well as Psalm 22 in the background. They also hear Jesus teaching that those who want to save their lives will lose them, but those who lose their lives will find them. Jesus' enemies don't understand him, and while they taunt him, Jesus' counter-wisdom is on display, speaking loudly in judgment of the wisdom of the powers and authorities who crucify him. Let's continue with verses 45 to 50. "From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, 'Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani,' which is, 'My God, why have you forsaken me?' When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, 'This man is calling for Elijah.' At once one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. But the other said, 'Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him.' Then Jesus cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last." The apocalyptic imagery begins. There is darkness over the whole land for 3 hours in the middle of the day. The audience remembers that Jesus said that there would be darkness at the coming of the Son of Man, at the coming of the human one. Speaking of the coming of the human one, in chapter 24, verse 29, Jesus said, "The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light." This darkness is a judgment on the powers that have crucified Jesus. The 3 hours of darkness evokes the 3 days of darkness that was one of the plagues of judgment on the Egyptian empire, which led to the liberation of Israel. Exodus 10:22 reads, "So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was dense darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days." Again, we have Exodus liberation imagery as the cross becomes a judgment on the empire. Then we get another quotation from Psalm 22. At 3 p.m, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" which is verbatim the first line of Psalm 22. Jesus has been betrayed by Judas, abandoned by his disciples and by the crowds, and now he is abandoned by God. What are we to make of this? In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus asked God not to have to go through with this crucifixion, but received no answer. And now he cries out that God has abandoned him. How do we understand this? Is Jesus divine, as has been indicated in this story? Then how can God abandon him? Does God abandon part of God's self? Or is the coming of the human one the discovery of God in the most desperate of human circumstances? The discovery of God in a human person being tortured and publicly executed. Does this statement by Jesus give us an important clue as to what this story is about? Psalm 22 is attributed to David, so Jesus' cry here is more David imagery. But the Psalms are also the prayers of Israel. So in quoting the Psalms, Jesus is praying, crying out in anguish with his people. As I have mentioned throughout this series, the original audience of the Gospel of Matthew would still have been recovering from, reeling from, the brutal destruction of Jerusalem and virtually all of Israel by the Romans in the year 70. It all culminated in a horrific scene in Jerusalem in which, according to Josephus, thousands of Jews were crucified. Jesus crying out on a cross that God has abandoned him gives voice to the anguish that Jews must have felt in the wake of that event. Israel had been crucified, and where was God? The author of Matthew and also the author of Mark, who also included this line in the crucifixion scene, they answer that question by saying that God is in Jesus, who is crucified with Israel. In making this move, the gospel writers present a conceptualization of God that subverts all dominant conceptualizations. The gospel started out telling us that the Son of God is not Caesar or any earthly king or emperor, but rather a peasant born in backwater Galilee. In other words, God is not found at the top of human society, but at the bottom, among those who suffer and are oppressed. Now we find out that this Son of God is not only crucified by the empire, but also experiences abandonment by God. Or maybe it is the abandonment by any conventional idea of a God that occupies and acts from a place of worldly power, that does not suffer with the most marginalized and oppressed people. That God has abandoned Jesus, and that God must be abandoned by those who follow Jesus. The text of the story has brought us to a point of disengagement with conventional conceptualizations of a patriarchal God who sides with the powerful. Jesus continues to be taunted by people who seem to pretend to misunderstand him and say that he is calling for Elijah. Then someone begins to show a little mercy, giving him sour wine, a common drink of soldiers. But this person is stopped by others mocking that they should wait to see if Elijah comes to save him. And it is then, in the midst of this mocking, that Jesus cries out with a loud voice and breathes his last. Well, that's what the NRSV translation says. Literally, it says that he gave up his spirit. The verb cry out is used several times in Psalm 22. It is also the verb used by the demons in chapter 8 that are strongly linked to the Roman military presence in the area, and that in the Gospel of Mark are even identified by the Roman military term legion. the demons that Jesus casts out into a herd of pigs. Elsewhere in the story, demons are referred to as spirits, the same word, sometimes with a different modifier, as the Spirit of God that is said to be on Jesus. Here, Jesus cries out and gives up his spirit. It is as if he has been exorcised by Rome. Rome has driven the spirit out of him. God has abandoned him, and Rome has driven the spirit out of him. And it happens at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the time of the evening sacrifice. Let's continue with verses 51 to 56. At that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now when the centurion and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, "Truly, this man was God's Son." Now we have gone full-blown apocalyptic with a crazy mass resurrection. But let's follow the imagery. The earthquake recalls again Jesus' teaching in chapter 24, in what scholars refer to as the little apocalypse. There Jesus says, "The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken." As I showed in episode 59 that covered this text, the stars or powers in the heavens in ancient Israelite prophetic texts signified the major earthly powers. The darkening or shaking or falling of stars and other heavenly powers, such as the sun and the moon, signified the fall of earthly empires and kingdoms. This earthquake is the shaking of the powers. The 3 hours of darkness has signaled judgment on the empire. The rending of the temple curtain signals judgment on the government led by the chief priests and the Sanhedrin at the temple. Earthquakes were common images in the prophetic and apocalyptic texts of ancient Israel to signal the shaking and fall of earthly powers and the transition to a new age from an old one. Here it signals that the old society is coming to an end and a new society is dawning. And the earthquake does this with a mass resurrection. Resurrection in Israel's literature signaled final victory over the empires and oppressive powers of the present age. The timing of this mass resurrection here is odd, indicating some sort of literary signal. It seems to occur both at the crucifixion of Jesus and at his resurrection, linking the two events together. But right away, this earthquake and mass resurrection compels the Roman soldiers to declare that this man, whom they just crucified, is the Son of God, giving him a title claimed by the Roman emperor. In his death, Jesus has triumphed over Caesar. The soldiers have kept watch, and they have witnessed the coming of the Son of Man, the coming of the human one. The cross is the judgment and victory over the powers of this world. It is the coming of the human one. My name is Bert Newton. The music for this episode has been provided by Bob Nolte and David Martin. Please spread the word about this podcast and give us ratings and reviews that will draw others to it. Thank you to all who have supported this podcast in the many ways that you have done that. Questions and comments can be sent to subversivewisdom@gmail.com. This has been episode 66 of Bible Study, Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel.